Hello, everybody. One day there's going to be a betting pool on how many seconds after I say hello does it take for me to say welcome. But yes, glad to be here in another day of life on Earth, and life as Darren, and life as a being, an organism, an animal, a mind. I'm going to try to make up for yesterday, which itself was a redo. My recording yesterday didn't succeed. Wow, that duck flipped all the way over. Okay, I just watched a duck do the duck equivalent of a cartwheel in the water, right? So that's nose straight down into the water and then complete 360 along the vertical axis, right? Pretty amazing. It's bathing time for these two mallards. And if you watch animals much, you'll realize that quickly that they, like humans, are profoundly suggestible, such that bathing time for a pair of ducks can quickly become bathing time for all local ducks. Geese can get involved. Humans will whip out their portable bathtub and start bathing right there on the spot. Life hitchhikes on other life, as if, whether or not the brilliant Mr. Sheldrake, whose speeches are much better than the book of his that I dabbled in, whether or not he's got it right about morphic resonance. I'll try to explain what that idea is in a moment. Nature resembles his theory. And if you watch it carefully, you will notice all kinds of synchronization behavior. Now, among humans, various things interfere with and impede this. But with animals, not so much. And plants and so on. So I'll briefly talk about some basic principles from Rupert's theory.
No.
Which is roundly rejected by most of science because it's not fundamentally materialistic, even though it has materialistic aspects. So, one of the speculations of morphic resonance is that it's really difficult to establish the first instance of a pattern or behavior in nature. Locally. So, for example, relatively challenging to forge the first local salt crystal on a planet. Once you've got a few of them, much easier. And so, from this perspective, the forms that we see, the oak tree, the trout, the phase state transition that we all love, where most of us love it, where the caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, or the larva transforms into a moth. I think we're less concerned with butterflies than moths, because moths cause us various kinds of trouble. Eating trees and clothing and such. Whereas butterflies rarely cause us trouble, in so much as I understand them at present. So, the forms that we see are historical lineages of the formation and recapitulation of the formation of the forms that we see. It's a recursive idea, right? Now, you can see evidence for this all over the place. We think, each of us usually thinks, that we are a separate individual person. To whatever degree that may or may not be true, what is definitely going on is that we are a reiteration of a historical lineage of persons. A new iteration of this lineage. And so too with all the organic forms we see, and even the physical forms of mineral crystallizations and so forth. So, under the banner of morphic resonance, form is contagious, behavior is contagious. But whether or not Sheldrake's theory has merit, and I think it does, it may not be the facts, but it's an extremely important perspective to be able to entertain. And as you've heard me say in many previous recordings, truth is not the only metric of value. Now, this is a very dangerous thing to say to humans in our time, because there are people saying something very similar, using this principle to sow discord, confusion, social, relational, economic, political, and military trouble, right? Just making trouble with a similar idea. It's not the same idea, though. I'm talking about the roots of the Greek word theoria, which imply an insightful perspective, a novel insight towards a way of seeing. And by seeing, we mean the metaphor of sight, not the formal fact of it. Right? We mean the kind of seeing that occurs in the mind, or in a mind. And so we mean something like a structuring of consciousness, a peculiar modal structuring of consciousness, including unique purposes, perspectives, orientations, and so forth. Now look, the whole idea here for me, I mean, I have multiple motivations, multiple simultaneous motivations, MSM. Obviously, one of them is to open and redirect and perhaps reforge the mind's eye, so to speak. But another is to practice the faculties that we employ to forge and convey concern, purpose, insight, understanding, awareness, consciousness. And I would almost always prefer, to do that actively with others in meet space. Okay? And you can, fill in the distance between the M and the T however you like there with with EA or EE. Ah, yes. But in my situation and at my age, this is proving to be very challenging. So, in effect, my listeners become stand-ins for actual interlocutors, companions in seeing and exploration. And without saying explicitly what my goal is, one of my goals is the recovery of certain forms of memory that I know to pre-exist my incarnation. This we might call anamnesis. An meaning not. Amnesis meaning something like forgetting, unforgetting. This is really my goal. However poorly I may approach or achieve it in any actual situation. So in the same way, a watchmaker or a runner or a dancer or a singer practices their art. And I do run, dance, and sing on occasion, though I do not make watches. Perhaps I provide or invent a position above our ordinary thoughts, concerns, and so forth. So in that sense, I'm a bit like a space traveler. I want to get outside the workaday thoughts and mind that are not in themselves bad, but they become very constraining and boring if that's the limit or extent of our experience. A tasty apple is amazing until you try to live on them. and you quickly realize, like, this is really good one time every few days, really terrible if it's the only food I have. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the inputs to our mentality, identity, and cognition are much like that, except that they often begin as counterfeit. And I don't know anyone who's straining at the leash to eat a fake apple. And maybe that was the problem with that strange fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now, it should be obvious, something that I said in a conversation with my son the other day. I can't recall exactly what I said, but it was something like, not only do I grant all of your criticisms of common human thought and behavior, I must admit in my own right that once I begin making face noises, I am usually mostly lying. Now, what do I mean by that? Because here I am, making such noises, and why would I be doing that if I thought that was just lying? Well, what I mean by that is that I think the fundamental original language is the language of relationships and mutually supportive endeavor. And so by the time we're making a lot of abstract ideas, we must be living in something like the outer space of relationships, right? Where most of what's going on is evacuative, right? It's sucking the life and content out of the possibility space of our lives and minds and relationships, and churning out who knows what, the relational equivalent of the Soylent Green crackers in the science fiction, right? Which are made of, human bodies. I'm fascinated by the possibilities of language in the way that a prisoner is fascinated with the bars of their cage. Well, that's not my only fascination. I strongly suspect that language is the result in our species of the loss over time of a variety of faculties that otherwise would make it redundant and mostly useless. And what do I mean? What do I think we lost? I think our species, if we encountered a person there's lots of stories, right, where somehow, right, for example, someone is frozen in ice and then thawed out 5,000 years later, science fiction scenario, or 10,000 years or 20,000 years later. That sound, that bird sound is not a hawk. That bird sound is mimicry. That sound, if it were a hawk, it would be piercing, right? But it's not piercing. Oh wait, that's not even what I thought it was at all. That's actually probably a squirrel. That might be a squirrel. Huh, that's really interesting. I've just learned something that never occurred to me before. The Steller's jays learn to mimic hawks. But I've noticed that the squirrels have a similar kind of call. And it never occurred to me that they might be mimicking their predators. And they do this, they sort of fall into a trance and emit this little yell, kind of a screech, right? And mostly at sunset, though I've not seen them at dawn. They might do it both times. So, I think if we encountered a human, if there was a way to encounter a human from, say, 10 or 12,000 years ago, we would encounter a being that is clairsentient, right? It cannot merely read our minds and participate directly in them. It can read and participate directly in what we would think of as the minds, anyway, of trees, a forest, the mountain, the lake, a flock of birds. Right? So I suspect that we were previously clairsentient. I have lots of good reasons to suspect that. But I also strongly suspect that we were participants in a network of non-human intelligences. And, those of you who've heard my recordings with some regularity will recognize the topic here, because I talk about it fairly frequently. And I don't necessarily believe that those non-human intelligences are only the kinds associated with anomalous aerial phenomena. I think there's a fabric within and above or beyond time-space, and the fabric itself is transcendent. And I think our minds were forged for contact with and participation in network intelligences. And this is part of why we're attempting to build them, which is among the most dangerous things we could possibly conceive of doing. Now, whether that means that endeavor is implicitly dangerous throughout time-space or not is not clear to me. But around here, it's lethally, devastatingly dangerous. The humans, for one thing, what you never want to do is train an actual transcendent mind on the content on the internet. That'd be asking for 9 kinds of trouble that you should never sign up for. Now, I'm not sure if I want to branch off on that topic or not, but I was listening to Michael Levin on a podcast, and he had not yet begun talking about a theory referred to as cognitive light cones, which I think just the idea of it is already really interesting. But before he got started, I branched off into this recording. My son and I fairly regularly have long 2, 3, 4 hour conversations about that orbit both my historical array of concerns, at least since the foundation of my present mind in 2002. And also religious topics in general, from a broad array of religions, but specifically inclusive of Advaita Vedanta, perspectives from Advaita Vedanta, which my son is a practitioner of. So for him, the idea that language is a mesh of delusions follows rather naturally from the Advaita Vedantist perspective that physical reality is itself illusory, that there is no such thing as a self. The self we imagine is also effectively not the kind of illusion that you would expect necessarily from delusional perception, but rather the kind of illusion, I think, at least this is the way I think of it usually, and not only, but rather the kind of illusion that arises in what we would call an optical illusion, where the situation itself generates
Thank you very much. Yes, I guess this is officially my first day.
Oh, really? It is your first day? Yeah.
Mhm. So, for example, if you're looking at a telephone pole with wires, you can orbit in your mind, right? Or possibly in physical space. You can do the same thing with a tree. You can orbit the tree so that certain branches are no longer visible to you. Right? Are the branches still there? Well, that's a philosophical question. And really, the question of is there sound in the forest if no one's there? And the tree falls is a question resembling this one. And a better version of the question, I think in some ways, for some purposes at least, is are the branches on the other side of the tree still there though nobody is seeing them? Now, I'm not particularly interested in this question today. What am I interested in? Well, it's complicated because I'm not sure. I'm actually pathfinding in process, much like one does during a wander, in which neither a specific path nor a specific destination are conceived of. I'm the kind of an idiot that is often found looking for Easter eggs in my own mind, right? And I mean Easter eggs in both senses. The strangely, absurdly colorful food objects that we, hide for children. And then also the sort of coder version of this, where you hide something in code or in a virtual setup for intrepid seekers to stumble across. Socrates, we are told by Plato, had this extremely important to him and many others practice. And there's a simple word for the practice that may be escaping me at the moment, but the one that I remember is maieudics. I think it's M-A-I-E-U-T-I-C-S, if I'm remembering correctly. And this is akin to a form of midwifery, birth guiding, that is oriented toward the production, sustainment, and nurturance of anamnesis, which I spoke of earlier. And to hear it told, Socrates would wander through the markets and recruit intelligent and insightful people to meet him at the agora, where they would spend the day pursuing matters of urgent mind crafting. And somewhat similarly to Jesus, if such a man existed, and many of us believe that he did, of course, the astonishing thing is that whether he did or he didn't it's not irrelevant, but the spirit of the pursuit of reverent adoration for the divine and the terrestrial is noble. Whether some specific spokesperson declared it historically or not. So in this case, what would I mean by the word noble? And here we begin to practice maieudics, right? Because rather than merely exchanging terms, we begin to inquire into the intent, the purposive soul of our linguistic behaviors, right? Our communications acts. We are often using words. Now, look, there are contexts in which the casual use of words is certainly appropriate. How are you feeling today? Kind of off. I had a rough night, like this kind of thing, right? No one stops. Nobody who's paying attention to their friend or, the person speaking is going to say, well, what do you mean by you? Right? Because it's obvious what is meant by you, and it's not a philosophical question, nor is it a invitation to philosophical inquiry. It's a friendly, friendly context. Surely the person who pretends like we could write comedy skits where someone always pretends that every use of language should be questioned this way, right? At the marketplace, how much for the apple? What do you mean by how? Right? Like, we could have a lot of fun with such skits in our imagination, or possibly, in TikTok videos. Thankfully, that's not my game. Though I do deeply appreciate and engage in humor as a form of intelligence. So I like to think, and maybe I'm pretending and maybe I'm pretentious, it could be both. Both could be true, that that you and I, and that my listeners as a clade and I, are engaging in meutics. Unfortunately, it's 2024. Socrates is dust. Though some of his ideas reach us perhaps through his student Plato, who was probably about as confused about Socrates as it is possible to be, yet adored him. Or rather, there are certain things that Plato was extremely confused about related to Socrates. That's a safer bet. So I like to think that we're engaged in something noble and beautiful. And in this case, what do I mean by noble? Rarely do I have to ask myself such a question, because for me, it's a bit like a guy's holding, someone is holding a compass. And it's the old kind of compass. Right? It has a magnetic needle, and it's happening here on Earth in a time when the Earth's magnetic fields are relatively stable. This person doesn't have to ask what he himself means by north on the compass. And nobility, in the sense that I'm using it and intending it here, is the orienting direction toward the true, the good, the beautiful, the holy, perhaps origin is a word that I would employ here. And I have a trope that I like to use, which I think is a direction we can actually travel in together whensoever we should agree to. And sometimes without the necessity of formal agreement. Which are thoughts, imaginings, and behaviors that are so profound and heroic, liberating, prison shattering, that they comprise the opposite of a bomb. These are visions and embodied enacted perspectives that are so potent that all of our ancestors, were they able, would sit up in their graves and cheer. In fact, probably the entire history and future of life on Earth would applaud and say yes, yes to this. And one can say, well, that's impossible. No, actually, it's not impossible. If you've ever been present at the birth of a human child, I've been present at one such event. Something very similar is going on there, and there are many other places where it is going on, and I promise you those places are not near the goalposts of sporting events, political rallies, or perhaps long ago in some cases successful military engagements may have qualified when they diverted the human future from catastrophic disorientation. In such cases, yes. Otherwise, definitely no. You're killing my children, right? The earth might say. The sky would say, right? And it's natural for the human beings to think of themselves as children of the earth. But we are not merely children of the earth, we are children of the sky. We are children of the before of the sky. And that's one of the features that religion sometimes attempts to remind us, to recall to awareness. Often in my prayers, I will say something resembling hand in hand, one family, one heart, one spirit, one origin, which recalls this true inheritance of ours. The gene package that builds our body is obviously astonishingly profound. But there's something far beyond it. That the many eyes of our souls recognize. Should it ever appear to them in our waking lives. As if I hesitate to say this, and probably for some reasonably good reason, but I'm going to go against my better judgment and say it anyway. As if a transcendent artificer had not merely impressed their fingerprint into the fundamental basis of physical reality, but rather the opposite. all of physical reality, all of form, all of mind, all of consciousness, all of structure is emerging instantaneously from the impassioned spirit of such an artificer, a watchmaker, if you will, except that it doesn't make machines. Thank goodness. The fingerprint I speak of is accessible to us, even in ordinary waking consciousness. And the humans are aware that under conditions of extremis, we may be awakened from the sort of stupors of tedium that often capture our consciousness. So many different things, so many different topics and subjects and perspectives are on my little drafting table at the moment, that occasionally I just become confused by their profusion, right? Which is why in some of my recordings I birdwalk quite a bit. It's better when I have I prefer it when I have a focused, the funny thing that might not be apparent, I'm not sure to what degree it may be to those who listen to me, and those who listen to me know, in some ways they may know me better than I know myself by far, because they hear, they sort of see the footsteps of my mind from outside. Whereas I myself am inside that hall of mirrors most of the time. And, the humans are very interested in getting to space so they can colonize and obliterate anything that they find out there with machines and war and stuff. Presuming that they would... Okay, all right, here's the topic. So I remember... a really profound film. Now, I think the book was written by S.E. Hinton. That's Hinton, if I remember correctly. And I remember sometime around the time I was like 18, 19. Francis Ford Coppola produced a film called Rumblefish. Just heard a bird I've never heard before, and someone else has heard it too. Or at least I heard a bird whose call I do not recognize. But I know this bird. or maybe not. I was profoundly affected by this film, and for some reason it is difficult for me to be deeply affected by media. I guess there's a bunch of complex reasons why that might be so. One of them, though, is that I remember the flavor of transcendent intelligence from a mind that once invested my mind with its experience. And it cast all human endeavor into a kind of shadow, because the terrible divine brightness of that mind if not buffered, would have slain me instantly. But it knew human minds, and so it buffered the intelligence. But I remember from Rumblefish a scene. Couple of brothers had an alcoholic father, brilliantly portrayed in the film. Everything in that film is fucking amazing to me still, right? I'm not sure I want to taste that fruit again, but I strongly recommend it. And I won't spoil it here. How am I going to do that now? All right. So the humans want to go to outer space. And there's little reason to believe that they would behave intelligently, even if they were let out of the cage. Presuming that Earth is something we could call a cage. And it seems likely that relieved of the compression that the Earth and gravity and our population and our machine population comprise, it's at least conceivable that we might, like bonobos, eschew war in favor of mutual adoration and loving kindness, intelligence, and turn our minds from, their fascination and subjugation with machines to something beautiful. It's conceivable. Most likely we would not, it seems to me. Though, for a time we might. And perhaps our nature, I don't believe that our nature is fundamentally warlike. I think it's the result of a series of accidents that damaged faculties that would otherwise pervade over consciousness and behavior. And that there were waves of this loss over time. Much like the echoes of an impact event. You know, if someone throws, say, a stone into the water, for example, right, you'll see these ripples. And I think what's happening inside our species is that our cognition is like that water. And each of the ripples drive us
trying to buy something, right? Like they make
further from our true nature and deprive us further of faculties essential to our well-being. And two of the symptoms of those waves, those ripples, are language and machines. And war. If you aren't building a lot of machines, you're unlikely to have war. And even if you do have war, and there are peoples who are ancient who will say, oh, bullshit, we had war. All we needed was arrows or knives or anything, right? We had war with fists and feet. And maybe that's true, at least occasionally. But it's not true universally. I believe that in a nurturing context, in a loving context, our species would become as beautifully relational as they would become prodigiously intelligent. However, intelligence itself may, as we usually think of it anyway, and particularly the intelligences associated with materialism and mechanism. They may be fertilized by crisis, right? And the crisis of the loss of faculties that would otherwise unify us in loving kindness and generosity and mutual concern. And it might be that much of prodigy would perish in the face of peace. Certainly many people have thought as much, and not a few have remarked upon it. They are inclined to believe, those who have thusly remarked, that artistic beauty and creativity are the benefit, right? Are like something that crisis and war and inner conflict naturally produce. Testing. Okay. Yeah, what happened yesterday is I took a break, and then somehow during the break, the connector for the mic dislodged, so that the next half of my talk was lost. I don't know what would happen to the humans if they were freed from the compression. But I also don't know what would happen to the humans if suddenly something shifted and they were reconnected to the originary intelligences our minds were born in the iridescent light of. Right? And I would suggest that if we were able to actually, if we were able to hear from human infants and babies, we would hear many reports of these intelligences that are parental or pre-parental, and that our children undergo something similar to what's happened to our species. They recapitulate the loss of the relationships with the originary intelligences or transsentiences. Humans have words for these things like gods, angels, demons, devas, genie, jinn. They probably have lots of other words that I've never heard that I would like to hear. Too. The other night, that's some time ago now, but I have a box of wooden matches, and okay, here we go. There's so many things on my table right now. So one of the topics that I played around with over the past couple days that I haven't visited yet today is the uptick of anomalies. That has been occurring for the past, there's the Monty Python skit about the Spanish Inquisition, right? No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapons are fear, surprise, fear. They just keep adding to the weapons. Right? And Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote a book some time ago that I read called The Black Swan, about the influence of unexpected world-shaking transitions on our lives, and mostly about how unexpected they are. Which is sort of like saying, blue is really surprising. It's so damn blue, right? That blue is crazily blue, but I don't have a clear, structured memory of Taleb's book in my thoughts, so it's possible that he did point in a direction similar to the one that I'm about to point to, but what nobody expected a black swan until they saw one, and then it became commonplace to know that there were swans who were black. But what the thing that really even probably Taleb didn't expect was that we might start producing factories that just keep producing nothing but anomalous, standout, history-shattering anomalies. Couple examples is there was a time in, I think, 2020 when in 3 different egg cartons, all the eggs had double yolks. But the other night I went to strike a match. I opened the box, right? Because I've got a box of wooden matches. Yeah. And all of the matches in that box looked like what I expected matches to look like. There's a wooden stick, and at the top, or at one end, we might say, of the stick, there's some colored chemistry, almost certainly including things like sulfur and perhaps magnesium and so forth. I'm not really sure what the standard complement of chemistries in a match head is. So yeah, all those matches, they look just like ordinary matches, but the one that I picked up was unlike any match I've ever seen. Sulfur and match head substance was dribbled along the entire length of the stick. So most of the matches are white with a green head. This match is white on 3 of its square sides, totally green on the other side. If you strike this match and it ignites, it's going to burn the whole stick at once, right? And the visual pun was so hilarious that I just started laughing, because I was like, oh shit, this is a visual pun of everything in my life. How could it possibly be so universally punny? The ordinary matchstick is like other people's minds. This matchstick is like Darren's mind, right? The ordinary matchstick is every year prior to 2024. The new matchstick is 2024, right? It doesn't make any kind of sense at all. And yet, there it is, right? It's real. It's not, this isn't a matchstick, comprised by an AI. And one of the things that the humans are not expecting, much like the Spanish Inquisition and the next black swan in Taleb's view, is they would not suspect, they think, the group think of the humans, is of a species that believes that tomorrow, much like yesterday, will follow the same principles. The groups of humans are dumb enough to call these principles laws. As if there were a God, and as if the God were some strange kind of lawyer. Sitting up there with pen and, quill and ink, writing the speed of light into stone. The fine structure constant, and so forth. Sheldrake, who I mentioned earlier, discovered that measurements of the speed of light made a long time ago. I can't recall how long ago, but let's say 80 years ago, presuming that such things could have been measured. Yeah, they must have been able to be measured back then. He noticed that the speed of light, as measured back then, was like 20 kilometers per second slower, which is a vast disagreement with something measured as carefully as the speed of light is. And so he went to the organization responsible. This is a big deal, right? It's the organization responsible for the preservation and correction of metrics of all kinds, right? What is an inch? You know, what is a pound? What is an ounce? What does 1 degree of Celsius mean? And he said, "Hey, I'm aware of this discrepancy." And they're like, "Oh, never mind that." Like, what do you mean? No, that was just a bunch of mistakes we made a long time ago. And Sheldrick said, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, we've generalized all the observations now, so that the actual speed of light is the mean, right? Or something like the average. Actually, I think those two things are different, average and mean. It was, we were just confused back then. And Sheldrake said, well, what if the speed of light was actually varying? And the guy said, well, we wouldn't know. And Sheldrake said, why not? What do you mean we wouldn't know? And the man said, well, we've defined the meter in terms of the average speed, so we would never notice the divergence. Right? In other words, we've defined the thing we measure with according to the generalization of the observation of light speed, so that if it were varying, we would not find out. Now, I mean, this is apropos of much of human history, and unfortunately, significant problems in language, science, and much more rarely mathematics. Though mathematicians have certainly believed insane things before.
Get their language done early.
I don't know. I know what happened to my own mind when suddenly the iridescent light of transcendent intelligence arose within it, restructuring it, reforming it. But that was certainly among the most dangerous things that could possibly have happened to me. If your goal was safety, if your goal was sanity, you'd stay in the box. Part of the Vulcan blessing, live long and prosper, is confused. Because if long life, if the habitual gravity of physical safety prevails over our life such that we live into dotage,
There's lots of leakage, right? I mean, there's lots of leakage when it comes to like using the energy.
physicists, very clear. They're talking about energy leakage, which is, a weirdly inappropriate topic in my own conversation. Some physicists from Britain were just walking by. I think they're from Britain. Were just walking by me and talking. If you're the kind of a person who wouldn't mind being encapsulated in some kind of spacecraft alone and shot off into space, then old age, might be enjoyable to you. But it turns out that what you really you don't want to just get yourself killed, right? You don't want to be so bold that adventure snuffs you, because you're probably going to just have to start over again. On the other hand, at the same time, one would not want to be so safe that the span of a life within it, there's no meaningful content or intelligence, no orienting intelligence. An artist, one of the best paths for people that live long is art. Though some forms of art, dancing comes to mind, are unlikely to be practicable in our older age.
No, but like in fairness to him, like it is a valid argument, right? Like,
And why am I on this
wealthy enough
topic?
to like have enough assets.
Those matchsticks, right? I remember in one conversation I was having with a friend, we were talking about UFOs. And I think I said something resembling the quote of Salvador Dali's, "Other people do drugs, I am drugs." Right? And I think I said something like, "Other people talk about UFOs, I am UFOs." If you want to fly to the outer space and you want to traverse dimensions, my mind is a pretty good vehicle, or at least something resembling an ignition switch. I'll give you some fuel, and with luck, something that can ignite that fuel. And hopefully, if I've given you good fuel, if we've given each other good fuel, then the burn will be coherent and not destroy the vehicle, right? When you see spacecraft, actually, the kind of vehicle that I think my mind comprises is not the kind that burns fuel to travel. And any intelligent being would realize that if you have to burn fuel to travel, you're not going to get anywhere. And you'll quickly soil your own environment so catastrophically that you better be able to get off planet right quick if you start doing that. But my goal wasn't to blow my own horn or peacock here. I'm just trying to say, I'm interested in what is above, beneath, and within ordinary human cognition. Where does that stuff come from? Why does it malfunction so catastrophically in so many ways? What is the origin of the problem of injustice that our species faces the new monster of? every day. And I'm fascinated by the important questions, like the root questions of existence, all of them. Okay, I do not recognize that sound. But yeah, I think I said to one of my friends, you know, other people talk about UFOs. I am UFOs. Which is partly true, but I'm also just as human as anyone else and encumbered by particularly the ironies of having a body, and having a mind that plays with concepts and structure as if they are real. You know, when if you meet others who are precociously intelligent, and this isn't always the result of crisis in their formative years, though many of them, for many, there's a correlation there, right? And you know, correlation isn't the same as cause. I did suffer an unusual crisis shortly after birth, which thankfully was quickly resolved, and my childhood was, compared to many other children, relatively idyllic. The parents loved each other. A psychiatrist or psychologist will notice that the way that I spoke just there, where I said the instead of my, must be meaningful. But yeah, the parents were congenial and themselves pretty intelligent, uninclined to radical divergences from caring behavior and so forth. So yeah, I had a pretty good childhood, but I was very precocious quite early. And if you encounter other humans, or if you yourself are unusually intelligent, you will recognize one particular feature, which is the children realized fairly early that something was either wrong with the minds of the adults, or they were lying, or both. And this often has something to do with language itself, and the children wrestling with the peculiarities of the difference between what is said and what is clearly either true or enacted, and also the very peculiar gravitational anomaly that arises in human consciousness and behavior that arises around prohibitions, right? You know, if I say something like, don't not forget to think about that thing that you're trying not to think about. This is a typical example of the KNOTTY, right? The naughty problem of language, prohibition, and consciousness. So yeah, children are very canny, and they're hyper aware of these things. And once they realize that something's wrong with the adults, and that the adults are not doing the things they're saying, and they clearly can't mean the things that they're saying, then the children can't tell whether the adults are intentionally defecting or there's something broken in them, but they sense that something is fundamentally wrong. So for example, when I was a child, and I have memories, going back to I have a few memories going back to fairly early in my childhood, and yes, I'm aware that those are the most likely to be distorted or reforged in some ways, but I was a child who had a natural adoration for living beings, plants and insects and snails and worms and little fishes and so forth. So whenever the adults would use poison on them, I was very concerned about this. Because my parents had told me, for example, that the organisms are delicate and they should be handled with care. So if they then killed them, this presented a conflict. But what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a kind of a fundamental mistrust of the superficial products of the human cognition and language that is common among prodigies. Now, along with this often comes something resembling mental illness or instability or vulnerability. But children who, for example, there are two kinds of prodigies that you'll see evidence of in elementary school. One of the kinds is they simply won't participate in what are called scholastic endeavors. And the other is that they outperform the other children fairly dramatically. And hopefully without much, they probably quickly learn not to lord that over the other children in any way, right? Not to wave the flag of their supremacy around, because the other children will attack them and eject them if they do that. So, lots of humans of this type, and various people who may be understood to belong to certain clinical categories I will not here mention, also have similar experience. They are alternately minded. Right? I usually use the phrase uniquely minded. And my father was very concerned that this would become a burden for me. It has been. I've paid certain prices, but most of the prices that I paid were not so much because of my some uncommon aspect of my intelligence or my capacity to demonstrate that. Rather, they were most of the repercussions that were, I think, negative, right, loss of relationships and so forth, had more to do with not being able to properly read my companions' concerns or state of their emotions, or right. I kind of went through life thinking we're all on the same page here. We're trying to solve the most important things to solve. We're trying to chase the sky the angels, the origins of intelligence together. And other people are like, dude, can we just catch a break? And have some bonding? This is something my son pointed out to me recently. But I imagine that many others have similar experience to this. And I think the reason that I got on this topic was I was linguistically, I had the marker of hyperlexical cognition when I was young. I read a lot, is a simpler way of saying it. And so my mind had many parents that were not my parents, the parents of my body. Particularly science fiction authors, as those of you know me know. Now the thread here that I'm going to recover is that actually living into old age is not particularly rewarding unless you are surrounded by loving, caring, family, students, so forth, right? You have to have something to walk with you toward the gateway of death. And most people who live long, that is not a blessing, though there are some for whom it is. You watch all of your friends and family die, you become feeble, your cognition changes, your capacity to enact whatever creativity you might once have practiced usually declines, not always. Others fail to see you, right? They no longer, if there's one prejudice in the West that's totally fatal to every participant, it's the rejection of and eviction from concern of the elderly. They are not seen unless they have some way they can demonstrate value very directly. Authors are less likely to be alone. Artists of various kinds. But as I approach my own dotage, I've got to say the landscape is unbelievably grim. And looks like a kind of like a situation where, how to put it, where one is consigned to a prison invisible to others while in their relational midst, right? So you're in the midst of people relating very effusively and fervently and passionately, but not with you. And I gotta tell you, like, this is some terrifying nightmare sauce in terms of having to live through it. I've been in similar situations before due to unusual life circumstances. And I've just recently celebrated my 60th birthday. And now I'm just beginning to understand what my recently deceased father must have been suffering without giving voice to that suffering. and it's grim and terrifying. So, I'm not so sure about the live long part of live long and prosper. Maybe in the imaginary universe of Vulcan society, the elders are revered. Though I recall a specific episode of Star Trek where Spock's father, I think there's a couple of episodes where his father is present but malfunctioning. Funny, his name escapes me at the moment, but it probably doesn't escape those of you who watch Star Trek. In one of the episodes, he is fighting to maintain mental coherence with a series of specific meditations designed to avoid this problem. Sarek is his name. And what's happening is that although he's avoiding the problem in his own mind, he's projecting a field that's affecting the entire starship. His breakdown is breaking down the relational integrity of an entire vessel. So the problem is evicted from his own mind, but then takes up residence in the local environment. I deeply wish that man would stop making the opposite of music that he makes on that corner nearly every day. But I also understand that he is in his dotage. I mean, he's doing what Sarek. He's gravely struggling to retain his skills and give something back to the world, perhaps. But what he's actually emitting is vicious to my ears. The mysteries of our humanity are beautiful and profound, but they are also tragic and desperate. So I would ask that we look with kindness and gentleness on our own struggles and life paths, and particularly on the plight. Everyone's concerned about the women and children to some degree. But we should be at least as concerned about the plight of the elderly and pay them very special attention and care. Any society that disposes of them in the way that ours does, or this one does, should be highly suspect, right? The children were right. The adults aren't doing what they're saying. They don't see the beauty and value in their own progenitors, ancestors, companions, and those who gave them care when they were young. Or something a bit stranger happens, which is the children become so concerned with their own, naturally, right? So concerned with their own crisis of disimpersonment that our cultures generate, that they're sort of checked out. Right? And then their elders perish, and with a shock they realize, this was the boat we were floating in, right? The boat of my mother's soul, the vessel of my father's soul. This was the only thing keeping us from foundering. Well, I am nearly at my home, where I will meet with my landlord briefly, and so for today, I will wind up hereabouts. I'm so grateful to all of you who listen and explore together with me. And I hope my voice is a comfort and in some ways a bit of a lighthouse for your own intelligences, speculations, creativities, and inclination to wander and play in the fields of the intelligences from which our own minds were born. I look forward to traveling together again very soon. And I'd be grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe, like, or comment. Ask me questions, I'll chase them. Thank you for joining me. All blessings to you and those you love, those they love, and those who love you. Bye-bye for now.